This podcast is brought to you by our friends at Alloy Health.
This is a woman who was actually a career woman. You know, she started teaching piano at age 19 after she got her board certification from the Royal School of Music, right? She started teaching at 19. And by this point, she was almost 50. So she had 3 decades of a career in Singapore, having been a concert pianist, having trained generations of young musicians. And here she is in Houston, Texas, having never done housework in her entire life, having never cooked anything but making spaghetti bolognese once in her life. And even her friends, said, "Oh my God, you're never going to survive."
Hello. Welcome back to Your Mama's Kitchen. This is the place where we explore how we are shaped as adults by the kitchens that we grew up in as kids. Not just the meals, but all the stuff that happened there. The laughter, the sibling rivalry, the music on the radio, the things that you saw out the kitchen window. I'm Michele Norris, and my guest today is Kevin Kwan. He's the author behind the wildly best-selling book, Crazy Rich Asians. Many of you know that book had its own hit film adaptation that rocked Hollywood and was a beacon for Asian representation on screen. He's written several books, all of them bestsellers, that explore the Asian Gilded Age and high society, and they include China Rich Girlfriend, Rich People Problems, Sex and Vanity, and Lies and Weddings. They are all international bestsellers. They've been translated into more than 40 languages. Kevin spent much of his childhood here in the U.S., but he was born in Singapore. And it turns out that the life that he and his family led were in some ways an inspiration for that avalanche of best-selling books. And we're going to talk about that today and so much more. Kevin, thank you for being with us.
It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here.
I have been looking forward to this conversation. I have been following you on Instagram, so I know that you love food. You like to spend time in the kitchen yourself. Here at Your Mama's Kitchen, that's the first question we always start with. Tell me about your mama's kitchen. And I want to ask you about 2 different kitchens. The kitchen in Singapore that you were in until you were 11 and moved to the U.S. If we can start there. And the house you grew up in, which sounds like it was large and filled with antiques and intergenerational, so filled with people also. So if you could sort of walk me through, you're outside playing, you come inside, it's time for dinner, and you walk through the foyer and whatever room you walk through to get back to the kitchen and where the food was being made. What would I see and what would I smell as I got closer to the kitchen, and what would it look like when I finally got there?
I mean, what a great place to start, taking me all the way back to Singapore. And, what I always like to say was a really Huck Finn childhood. I mean, it was kind of this last beautiful era of Singapore where we were really island kids. I was an island boy. I grew up barefoot, right? Or in flip-flops.
That's so interesting because you think of Singapore now as a bright, shining city full of skyscrapers.
Yeah. I mean, there was that part too. But, we lived in a house on top of a hill that had beautiful panoramic views of the island. And it was a house that my grandparents built. And it was large, but it wasn't large in the way that Beverly Hills McMansions are large now, right? It was large for a purpose because a whole family lived there, At the time it was built, my grandparents had 4 children, right? And then there was an extended family, there was staff. So every room had its purpose, put it this way, right? Every room really was meant for different things, different usages in life. And so that's the world I sort of grew up in. And I would be playing out with my friends. We had a little bicycle gang, We'd go around the little neighborhood. But every night at 7 p.m., one of our maids would sound the dinner gong. And it was an old-fashioned, it looked like a little mini xylophone. It had a beautiful little,
Would she play it like a song?
Yeah,
were there notes that she? What did that
sing.
sound like? Do you remember the?
It was
the
like
sequence.
Dong 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 dong. Just she'd play this very simple little melody. And you just knew, okay, it's time to come home, wash your hands, you know, make yourself a little neat and tidy. And then it's time for dinner with the whole family, you know, and that would be my parents, my brothers, my grandparents, my aunt, and then whoever was visiting for the evening. We often had visitors.
Big dining room?
Big dining room, you know, big round table that my grandmother presided over. And then, of course, there's the kitchen, right? And I was like the kitchen boy. I loved going into the kitchen to see what was up. And the kitchen was just off the dining room. It was a big rectangular room. And there was also a big communal dining table there too, a more informal dining table where we would have breakfasts and lunches. So, you know, I grew up literally in the kitchen every morning having breakfast, but I'd love to see what, you know, our amazing cook was doing. And it was always a bustling hive of activity because it was such a food-centered home, but so much of the food back then, you know, took days and days to prepare, right? So things were always being prepped and prepared. You know, I remember, for example, there's a lovely coconut jam that we make in Singapore called kaya. And it's this just amazing, you know, thick, almost caramel-like coconut jam. And I loved it. And I remember one day, you know, sort of pleading the cook to make some for me. I was craving it. And she was kind of grumpy. And I didn't understand why, right? But she acquiesced. You know, I was very indulged. And then I saw that it took them 2 days to make this.
Oh, you had to cook it down.
I mean, they had to get the coconuts and grate them and then puree them and then, you know, reduce it over a double boiler.
Oh.
You know, and I remember just being so impatient going, when's it going to be ready? When's it going to be ready? But in the act of that, also having this new awareness that things take time, you know, good things take time. And it's also so labor intensive to do this. You know, I remember seeing our cook, you know, literally fanning the flames, you know, underneath the double boiler because for some reason they did it in the courtyard. Over an open flame.
Over an open flame.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was really beautifully antiquated in a way in this old enamel double boiler, but it got us an amazing flavor, right? So I had a new appreciation for what it took them to create even the simplest foods that I would, you know, so take for granted.
So I want you to describe the kitchen. You said it was a rectangular space. Singapore had a strong colonial aesthetic. And so were you in a kitchen that was an Asian kitchen or did it look like an English country kitchen? Because you could find both in a grand mansion in Singapore.
Yeah, it was definitely more because the house was designed, I believe, in the 40s or late 40s. It was more of an international modern style. So it was a bungalow, you know, it was a white bungalow, streamlined, maybe with even Art Deco influences. So the kitchen, everything was very streamlined. And so there were many stoves, but there was a big main stove where the wok took center stage because most of the cooking took place, you know, in the wok.
Multi-burner stove, I imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's my memory of it. But it was run very much like an English house, you know, with the colonial influence. And the other feature of the kitchen was on the other wall was this huge contraption that it was one of these old-fashioned room indicators, kind of like they had in Downton Abbey, right?
Really?
So in every room of the house, there was a push button where you could push and it would tell, you know, the servants which room needed something, needed attention. And it, you know, In Downton Abbey, it's a bell system. Like a
Right.
bell rings and you see a little placard. Here, it was almost like one of these old-fashioned airport, kind of those flip things that will flip a number.
Oh, yes, like a ticker tape kind of thing that you see.
So like
You see it like
number would
TWA or
appear.
something.
Exactly.
Yes.
In this big, giant box, And so that was at the back of the kitchen room. And then
What
the front
was your
the
number
stove.
for your room? Do you remember?
I think we were number 4.
Uh-huh. Were
I
you
actually
blowing that
don't
up as a
know.
kid? Were you like pushing that button all the time?
No, not really. I don't think we used it much, because we were running around, right? And just doing whatever we wanted. It was, I think, something more that my grandparents used.
Okay.
Yeah. It never occurred to us to push the button. We would just yell if we needed something.
You described yourself as a kitchen kid. What did that mean? Were you allowed to actually help, or were you allowed basically to observe?
I was occasionally allowed to help, but it was mainly observation. I remember once helping to sort out the rice, right? I remember once there was a big pan of rice, and I guess they would get these big bags of rice where you would sort out the grains, because there were some grains that were more translucent, and that was the glutinous rice. And that it all came in the same bag. So someone's job was to sort out the rice. From my memory. This is all coming back right now for the first time in 40-something years, Michele. So,
Well, how convenient for us. This is interesting. What did you want the glutinous rice, or were that's the stuff you didn't want? What was the pecking order there?
You wanted the normal rice to make normal, fluffy white rice. And the glutinous rice was for glutinous rice dishes, right? Mm-hmm. There was another beautiful dish that we made. That's, we called it growing up, we called it zong, which is a Cantonese word, but it's like it's a rice packet, right? It's like a rice dumpling that's kind of pyramid shaped. And the beautiful thing about these rice dumplings was it was a ritual that was seasonal, and it involves all the interconnected families that were sort of part of our extended family. At some point every year, they would begin harvesting these leaves, these long, I think they were leaves from a bamboo plant. And so someone would come over, they would begin hacking down these leaves. Maybe they were banana leaves. And then banana
leaves would make sense.
Yeah. And then they would, I'm sorry for my ignorance. I really
that's okay.
should have been better prepared for this. But then they would, they would soak the leaves in these big pails of water, dry the leaves, and the leaves were what held these glutinous rice dumplings. Then all the different cooks from the different households, my granduncle, another aunt had a cook. They'd all come over and they'd spend days and days making these huge vats of rice, different rice dumplings filled with different ingredients. Some of them were savory, had, lovely pork or chicken, and, some had sweet red bean. Some were glutinous rice balls that you would eat with honey. Or treacle, golden syrup, Lyle's golden syrup over. So, but they would make thousands of these dumplings and wrap them up in these banana leaves into these lovely pyramid shaped dumplings. And then they would go into these giant steamers. And they would do these outdoors in the garage. And I just remember it was a whole week of all these people coming together.
What was the occasion for this?
I think it coincided with some lunar festival
or something.
It wasn't a New Year thing, because New Year had different foods. Every season, every holiday had different foods.
It's just a beautiful tradition. It's spelled ZHONG for people listening.
Yeah.
Is that correct? In
Yes.
case, you at the end of this episode want to run to the Google or run to a cookbook of sorts to learn more about the food or the tradition. But it sounds like it's just beautiful that your family and their extended staffs coming together, everybody having a role to play.
Everyone had a role to play. And then the dumplings were always divvied up between the families, right? So it was really it linked the families in a very special way. And I think also, as I got older and began to really sort of realize what was happening, so many of these people that had been on staff, had been on staff for decades and decades and decades with these families, and they knew each other and they were friends, and this was their time to get together and trade gossip. You know what I mean? And so, I've even remember sometimes, when we would go over to an uncle's house for a party, my nanny would come along. My nanny was one of these we called them the old-fashioned black and white amas. There was a certain group of women from southern China called the black and white amas, and they only dressed in a uniform of black and white silk. And they took a vow of chastity at, age 16 or whatever. And they, moved from China to Singapore, and they were in service to a family, for their lives, really. They were paid, right? Of course, but this was kind of the pledge they made, and they joined a family. And so she was very much a part of our family. She raised my aunt as a baby, and then she raised me and my two brothers, and she very happily decided to retire, in her early 80s. She made the choice of retiring and going back to China, a rich woman, because she'd saved all her money for decades and decades and decades. Wow. And she went back, she built a big house, she got a satellite dish for her village, and she became the queen of her village, and I think played poker for the next 15 years of her life.
That sounds like another book. I'm fascinated by that story.
But I digress. But I remember, she came along with us to one of these family parties because she just wanted to come to that house to gossip with her friends in that household.
This reminds me of the scene in Crazy Rich Asian, in the book and the film, where they're coming together and they're all, I don't know if they were making rice dumplings or as long at that point, but there was a dumpling ritual.
Yes. Yeah.
And it was a test at that point. Was that an inspiration for what you wound up writing in the book, and then it wound up in the film as well?
So that scene was never in my book. That's a very interesting little detail that you point out. That scene was actually inspired from a memory that the director John Chu had of his family, gathering around the table, making dumplings. Like, that's a very specific memory from his childhood that we worked into the movie.
And were you okay with that? Because
absolutely.
It aligned with what you recalled as well.
It aligned with what we needed to do for the movie, in that we needed to create a sense of family and have a moment where the family could come together and demonstrate the connections to Rachel Chu, number one. And I loved it that it was also a memory that John could bring into the movie. It's as much his as mine, right? So I loved him having this very personal moment there. And also, I do remember these rituals, where we would gather around food. So it really worked on so many levels, but it wasn't an exact memory from my childhood or from my books, because the women in my family back then, they didn't touch food. Right? So that's the other side of the coin, where I, as a kid, I was allowed to wander through the kitchen, right, and poke around and see what was going on. My mother never entered the kitchen. It was, I wouldn't say forbidden, but it's just something she wouldn't think of doing.
Someone else did that. Someone else took care of that.
The cook had her job, right? And she was, that was her kingdom, right? And I remember actually one of the clearest childhood memories I have is of my mother once cooking in that kitchen. And it was so unheard of that everyone gathered around to watch this happen, right? Because I think she'd been to a party and she had tried this new exotic dish, and she was always trying to find a way for her kids to eat vegetables. We hated eating our veggies, right? So she got this recipe and started making this dish by herself. And I just remember watching her and watching all the adults gather. Like my grandparents came downstairs because they'd never seen my mom in the kitchen before cooking. And the maids were looking horrified. The cook was very disapprovingly going, "What are you doing in my kitchen?" You know. And you know what my mom was making?
What?
Spaghetti bolognese.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah.
That was something new and exotic?
It was new and exotic. And, you know, this spaghetti had, you know, a lot of chopped up onions and green peppers and tomatoes, you know, like, and carrots, I think, mixed in with the ground beef, of course, right? And of course, you know, it was yummy and, you know, we were hooked for life. But that was the first time I'd ever seen my mom cook in a kitchen.
What a wonderful memory. She must have been so proud of herself.
She truly was. Yeah. But that was the only time she was allowed in the kitchen in my memory in Singapore, you know, and all that changed when we moved.
But before we get to the move, because this is a transition point to talk about the move, but it might be helpful to sort of scale back a little bit to learn a little bit about your family, which is, you know, your family was extraordinary, aristocratic family, businessmen, you know, owner of one of the first banks in Singapore. Can you sort of give us a little bit of a family tree?
Yeah, that was my great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather was a merchant and a banker. And, you know, he had moved, he was a magistrate and a businessman back in China. And he had moved, I think, in the late 19th century, early turn of the century to Singapore, where he had restaged his businesses. So his daughter was my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
And so she really grew up in that world, right? That was kind of this world of imperial splendor. You know, she had so many memories of her childhood. And, you know, those were truly, that was the crazy rich generation. Mm-hmm. We were not, right? You know, she lived on a vast property, you know, vast lands, you know, and, you know, sort of had this very, very rarefied life. And then she married a doctor, my mm-hmm. grandfather, you know, mm-hmm. who had moved from Hong Kong in an arranged marriage and married her. And it was one of these marriages that actually worked out beautifully. You know, they were very much in love and very, very dedicated and devoted to one another. And he was a good man. Mm-hmm. And I think because of her financial security, he was really able to devote so much of his medical practice to being a humanitarian doctor, right? He purposely kept his clinic in the old part of Chinatown in Singapore. He really wanted to be of service to the elderly Chinese immigrants. You know, he could speak Mandarin. Mm-hmm. We could not. My father could not, you know, but he still had the memory of old China. He was very scholarly. And so he wanted to be that bridge between generations. And so much of his work, I think, was giving free medical services. And I think that's eventually what got him noticed and knighted by the Queen, you know, because of his years of dedicated humanitarian work.
You just mentioned that your grandfather was knighted by the Queen, which I think requires just a little bit more, a few words about that. That must be an incredible point of pride in your family.
It is. I mean, we were very proud of him. I mean, it happened way before I was born, but, you know, I remember as a child, you know, seeing the framed certificates and all that, you know, with the Queen's signature in the house. Interestingly enough, he was such a modest man. And he really, truly was such a true healer and humanitarian. He initially tried to refuse the knighthood. That's the family lore, you know, because he was like, what is this? I don't want it. I don't care, you know. And then he was told, well, you can't actually refuse the Queen. Yeah. You know, she will do what she wants. And if she's going to bestow, you know, a knighthood on you, you're going to have to deal with it. Right. So of course, he graciously acquiesced. That's the real story. But he never sort of made a big deal out of it. He never went by Sir Arthur or anything like that. Like he always was Dr. Arthur Kwan. That was what he was most proud of, first and foremost.
He must have been incredibly respected in Singapore.
He was. He really was. Beloved, I think, more than anything else, and that was my memory of him, always a man who was of such astounding integrity and character, and just kindness, just pure kindness.
I love that you added that rejoinder, because I noted that he probably was respected, but you said he was beloved. And I think that's so important because a lot of people are a lot of people are respected, but sometimes that's based in fear. Sometimes that's based in, them putting them on such a pedestal because they are so powerful that they're almost otherworldly. To say someone is beloved means that they're accessible, it just means something completely different. So thank you for making that distinction. I think it's an important
for letting
one.
me. Yeah.
Hey, future hosts, tired of the same old routine? It's time to switch things up with Airbnb. Whether you have a cozy cabin in the woods, a chic city apartment, or a beachfront retreat, your space could be the perfect stay for travelers looking for something unique. By hosting on Airbnb, you can share your home with guests who want to live like a true insider wherever they happen to be. Imagine helping someone wake up to the sound of waves crashing outside their window, or enjoy a morning coffee on your porch with a panoramic view of the mountains in the distance. With Airbnb, you can make those moments possible. But hosting isn't just about the space, it's also about the experience. As a host, you get to share your local favorite spots, from hidden cafes to must-see attractions, helping your guests explore like a pro. Plus, with flexible hosting options and easy-to-use tools, managing your listing is a breeze. Whether you're looking to earn extra income for a weekend or build a long-term hosting business, Airbnb has you covered. Ready to turn your space into a destination and travel smarter as a host? Your home could be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host. Hey there, it's Michele Norris. I'm sure you've heard of that term, aging gracefully. That's all good and fine, but I think most of us really want to age healthily. And that's why I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about Alloy. It's a company that gives women a toolkit designed to help them do just that, to age healthily. Alloy recognized that this can be a challenge as women get beyond their 40s and inch closer to menopause. I'm actually extremely lucky myself because one of my besties is a well-known OBGYN doctor who happens to be a chief medical advisor for Alloy. I've been able to turn to her for advice. I can ask her those awkward questions confidentially and get an answer without judgment. But many of us don't have that. Many of us are alone, sitting up late at night behind the glow of our phone, searching for symptoms and feeling scared and feeling alone. Well, times are changing for us. We have new resources available at our fingertips, and Alloy provides just that. With Alloy, you get safe, effective, FDA-approved solutions to your menopause symptoms prescribed by menopause-trained doctors. Plus, they have a best-selling skincare line with clinically proven moisturizers created for women over 40, and also hair care products to fight the thinning and loss that's so common as we age. All that and solutions to help with sexual wellness and improved intimacy. There's no need to make an appointment, wait at a doctor's office, or stand in line at a pharmacy. You can do everything from your phone. And then Alloy sends everything right back to you with free shipping. Menopause is inevitable, but suffering doesn't have to be. Alloy has everything you need to age happily, gracefully, and healthily. Go to myalloy.com to start your consult with a menopause-trained expert today, and make sure to use code KITCHEN to get $20 off your first order. One of the things that I love to do is host a backyard barbecue with my friends, serving up something delicious, saying I love you through food. saying that summer has officially begun. But sometimes it'll be such a gorgeous day outside that I'll at the last minute decide to have friends over. And Whole Foods Market makes pulling together a last-minute barbecue doable and delicious. I browse my options on the app, which is surprisingly easy to use. I choose a few proteins for the grill, maybe some wild-caught, sustainable salmon burgers, maybe some no antibiotics ever chicken thighs, maybe some organic grass-fed beef burgers or some uncured hot dogs. I add a few vegetable sides, zucchini, asparagus, maybe some great corn, and boom, the ingredients are delivered directly to my door, directly to my house within an hour or two. And this idea for a backyard barbecue at the last minute suddenly becomes a reality. There are so many ways to save on summer grilling favorites at Whole Foods Market.
You know, my grandmother, I think she'd always held this position in society, you know, that was kind of unassailable, right? And she was truly kind of this very Brooke Astor-like character, right? She was extremely regal, very reserved, and from everything I know of her, very accomplished in her own right. You know, she was the first in her generation to, well, first of all, she was the first in her generation not to have bound feet, right?
Wow.
If you can even imagine that, you know, her mother, you know, it was a mark of gentility, right, and aristocracy for well-born Chinese women to have their feet bound. And it rendered them helpless, basically.
There are people who are listening to this who might not understand what that means, so maybe we should explain this.
Starting from an early age, they would bind their feet so that they remained tiny and, I guess, cute looking, right?
It was
and
an idea of femininity.
It was the idea of femininity and gentility and beauty. Like, you know, well-born women have tiny bound feet, you know, and they would be intricately bound and they would wear these little silk shoes, right? Almost like ballet slippers, but their feet were tiny. And that was the standard to which people aspired to. But my grandmother, you know, she recalls being horrified, right, by the thought of this and by seeing what would happen every night when they unbound her mother's feet and had to clean it, right? You know, her maids would do a cleaning ritual and soaking it in warm water, and basically, you know, your feet become deformed.
Yeah.
Right? Your toes get broken. It's a disability, truly, right? And it's a barbaric practice, really.
And you really, you have a certain degree of immobility.
You can't really walk. And that was the point. You know, we're too privileged to even walk. We're carried everywhere, you know, or we walk in little dainty steps. And, you know, I mean, of course, it had been a tradition for thousands of years, but it ended with my grandmother. And so she was a rebel from the very start, right? And refused to have her feet bound, and convinced my great-grandfather to you know, so let her skip this archaic, cruel ritual. And so that happened. And then she also went to school. You know, she was the first woman of her long line of you know, people in her family to be educated. You know, she got the equivalent of her high school degree. There's a photograph, I think, of the first graduating class of the Nanyang Girls' School in Singapore. And she's front row center in that photograph, holding her diploma.
Yeah.
Right. And so she, you know, and I was told that she was head of the class, always the most accomplished, you know, scholarly, but also the best artist, the best embroiderer, the best needlepoint, the best everything. You know, she was always the best. And certainly from looking at photographs of her, she was the best dressed, no question. I mean, she was just elegance personified, but also had such a beautiful flair for fashion in her day. And then she married my grandfather. And years later, I learned that a lot of her volunteer work had to do with family planning.
Really?
And helping women, with family planning issues.
Which would have been controversial.
In its day. Yeah. So in her own quiet way, she was formidably ahead of her time. Right. But I think all that put a lot of pressure on my dad. Number one. Right. And he was sent abroad in his early teens. I think he was 13 years old. He was sent to Australia to a boarding school, and then to, secondary school, and then college. He went to University of Sydney, and he spent a good, at least 10 years away, more than 10 years. So his formative years from 13 to like 23, 25 were in Australia. So and imagine having that life.
Did that change him in some way when he came back to Singapore? It sounds like a collision of cultures when he returned.
Yeah, I think profoundly, because he would spend the summers working at a ranch in the outback. I have his photo albums. You see these amazing photographs of him, out in the Australian countryside on motorcycles. You know what I mean?
Wow.
At the beach. And it's always interesting because there are these beautiful class photos, right? And they look like these old Princeton varsity rowing team photos, or you see all these men in double-breasted jackets and ties sitting in very neat rows, and there's the professor in the front row and all these, young men. And then there's my dad, the one Chinese Singaporean man in literally, hundreds of classmates who were all, Aussie and Caucasian. And that was the stark reality of it. But he never once told me, never once did he mention it was ever an issue or a problem. Right? I mean, these were his friends. He adjusted well to Australia. And I think it was probably quite a shock for him to have to come back to, Singapore in his mid-20s.
What were the expectations for him when he returned to Singapore?
I mean, he's the firstborn son, right? He's the namesake. So I think the expectations were that he marry an appropriate woman and continue the line and give my grandparents lots of grandkids, right? And also be that dutiful son, right? That moves home with mom and dad and takes care of them into, as they begin to age and, and all that, right? And that's what he did.
So how did he meet your mom?
Church.
Okay, because your grandparents were in an arranged marriage, and so I was wondering if that tradition continued.
It didn't. It stopped with their generation.
Okay.
He went to Wesley Methodist Church in Singapore, and my mother also went there. She was the daughter of a Methodist minister, actually. That's a whole other story. But they met at, I think, Methodist Youth Fellowship, and courted for 5 years, and then.
Married, had kids. Lived happily in Singapore.
And
then decided to move, of all places, to Texas.
Houston, Texas. Yeah.
Was he looking for that sort of outback experience that he had in Australia and hoping to find it in the biggest state in the United States?
I think that was very much part of, the lure of moving. I think he, at the heart of it, really loved that lifestyle, right? And loved the Western lifestyle. And I think also for him being here represented having a personal freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you move back in your 20s to your parents' house and stay there for the next 25 years, that's a commitment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, in its own way, I think, very emotionally stultifying.
It could feel like a cage.
Right? Yeah. Because it's not your house. It's your mama's house.
So
and she's calling all the shots, right? She's still very much the queen of the palace. And so I think in many ways it was very challenging for my parents to have a life and to raise their kids, under this microscopic scrutiny, of the mother and the mother-in-law, but also society in Singapore was also, it's, what I write about. It's such a small little hothouse of intrigue and gossip and social machinations and whatnot, right? And it's funny. These are the things that fascinate me. These are the things that make my way into my novels. But I think for my dad, he could have cared less.
Mm.
And he very much took after my grandfather.
The humanitarian.
Absolutely. Yeah. But beyond that, just a man with no pretensions at all, and I think he didn't really like what he was seeing in the way that society was changing and how the island was becoming crazy rich, right? And it was all about money suddenly and not about values, and I think
it's a tiny island with more millionaires than any other in the world for its size. Do you think that he moved in some way for you and your siblings?
He did. I think he also saw that my older brothers, at least, were sort of struggling in the educational system. Because we were, even within these families, we were a very unusual family in the sense that we were sort of these colonial Singaporean Chinese, right?
And that meant what?
It meant that we were
societal order.
We were English educated. We only spoke English at home. He only spoke English, right? My grandfather spoke with this clipped British accent, right? Because he had been educated in Scotland, University of Edinburgh. And in the 70s, when Singapore gained its independence, actually, that happened in the 60s, but they slowly changed the education system where they wanted every student to master English, but also Mandarin Chinese. And for families that were multilingual, that was easy, right? If you grow up phonetically hearing Mandarin spoken, you learn it pretty easily. But when you grow up in a household where you don't hear it at all, it's like learning any very, very challenging, language. And I think my brothers really struggled with that. So much of their lives, so much of my life in Singapore was the tutor, the Chinese tutor, teaching us, drilling us, and we were flunking miserably. And
in a very, should be said, very competitive education system. Singapore is
Extremely
one of the best education systems in the world, but it's very competitive and students are sorted very early. And once you are sorted in those categories, it's hard to move.
Yeah. And
out
beginning
of that
with
category.
grade 1, how you do in first grade sets the tone for what class you get into second grade, right? So, if you were in 1A, you want to go to 2A and not 2B, for example, so it's the stratification begins very, very early. And I think my brothers were struggling a bit with that. And
so they wanted something different for you.
Yeah.
And of all the places, he opened up a map, I guess, and chose Texas.
Well, he had connections to Texas. And if you remember, Houston back in the late 70s, early 80s was a boom town.
Oh, totally. Yes.
Right? And NASA, it was the center of the aerospace industry. It was the city of the future. So there
Yeah, a
was
lot of cancer research there also.
Exactly.
MD
So there was
Anderson,
a lot going for Houston. And I think that really factored in his decision to like, this is the future, you know? And I remember because, you know, he didn't tell me until about a month before we were going to leave. Right. I was the happy kid. I was the kid that actually was doing well in school, you know, but, you know, by this point he'd made the decision and, you know, he was like, pack up a box, whatever you want to take. It's going on a ship. And then we're leaving in a month, you know? And I was initially really upset, right? Because I was at that age where I was really making, you know, really making friends for the first time. Really, you know, you're sort of preteens, but you're part of this gang and, you know, I was really coming into my own for the first time, you know? And then now you have to leave. Right. But I remember him saying, he's like, you know, when we move to the States, you're going to love school because school will be fun. School will be fun for you. And I couldn't even wrap my head around that idea. Right. But he was right. School was fun.
Yeah. And you took to Houston.
I did.
Pretty easily. What about your family? Because it would have been an incredible transition for them, not just a geographic transition, but in every possible way. The food, the climate, the culture, class issues, you know, walking into a space where everyone doesn't know you or doesn't know your family background. How did they handle the transition?
So it's interesting. I think every family member had a different transition, right? And speaking for myself, I think I was so lucky in many ways. 11 was the right age for me to move because I was old enough to have a very distinct memory of Singapore, right? And growing up in a culture where I was not in the minority. You know, I think that consciousness of growing up not feeling like you are othered for the first decade of your life is something that just remains with you. So I think by the time I came at age 11, I was naturally confident. Number one, you know, I didn't see myself as a second-class citizen or, you know, whatever. And the other advantage was I spoke English, right? Which is something that most immigrants don't have, right? I'm not only fluent, I'm better at English than most of the kids in my grade at this point, you know? And so also the other advantage was Singapore was so multicultural. And also so westernized. You know, my neighbors growing up, you know, was on one side, it was a British family, right? And so my playmates were these British kids. And on the other side, it was a kid from New Zealand, you know, and across the street, it was an Indian family. And that was the neighborhood gang. You know, it was very, very multicultural. And so I grew up kind of colorblind in that way, right? And so the white kids were just my neighbors. Right. So there wasn't a racial shock coming into an American middle school.
Was that true for your parents, though? Did they have more of a shock?
I think my dad did not, because let's not forget, you know, he grew up in Australia.
Okay. But what about your mom who,
so my mom,
you know, had cooked spaghetti bolognese
once in her life.
Once, and now is in Houston and, you know, going to the grocery store and probably cooking for the family.
So she had the hardest time of all, right? This is a woman who she was actually a career woman. You know, she started teaching piano at age 19 after she got her board certification from the Royal School of Music, right? Started teaching at 19. And by this point, she was almost 50. So she had 3 decades of a career in Singapore, having been a concert pianist, having trained generations of young musicians. And here she is in Houston, Texas, having never done housework in her entire life, having never cooked anything but making spaghetti bolognese once in her life. And even her friends, said, "Oh my God, you're never going to survive. You will never survive this." Right? They were mad at my dad. I think
wait, why are you doing this to her?
Why are you abusing your wife like this? Because it would be such a profound change in lifestyle for her, So and I remember I was also, the first year was tough because I also had to adjust, right, to this amazing new concept called housework, right? My dad would be like, "Go mow a lawn. Here's lawnmower. Go out there and clean up the yard." There's household chores to do. And, at first I couldn't understand why this was happening. But after a while, you realize, there's no one else to do it.
And all the other kids are doing chores too.
Yeah.
So
exactly. This is just the new life, right? And so I was very adaptable and, took a couple of months, but then you get with the program, right? Because you have no choice.
Yeah. Did your mom feel that way also? I just got to get with the program because what's the alternative?
What's the alternative? And, for a woman who had never cooked at age 50, to have to figure out a grocery store, figure out how to cook. She is now an amazing cook.
Oh, I love to hear that.
Right.
I was not sure where that was going to go.
She's now an amazing cook. And now when she goes back to Singapore, she loves to show off for her friends. And they're in disbelief.
You have a beautiful relationship with your parents. And I was reading about, in particular, your relationship with your father when he was diagnosed with cancer. You decided to go back and spend as much time as you could with him. And you became his helper. And there were a lot of appointments, and you were the one who got him where he needed to go.
It was a big group effort. My brothers and I all took turns. As it takes a village.
Yeah.
It's an army.
Yeah.
And the whole family gets involved when you have to battle cancer, right? And so we really felt immediately that we just needed to be a support system.
And it's when you're walking a family member through something like that, there's also an opportunity to add a new dimension to your relationship when you're not necessarily parenting them, but they're leaning on you now.
Absolutely. For most people, pancreatic cancer is almost an immediate death sentence, right? The mortality rate is between 3 to 6 months. And so we mobilized. Spending that time with him was so precious, because every day I drove him downtown for his radiation treatments, so we had 2 hours in the car back and forth. And I didn't want to be morbid, right? But there were so many stories I wanted to know about his childhood, because I had just heard them anecdotally through the years, and I didn't even know they were true, right? And it's not something you really focused on. You just hear these stories now and then, but, I had always heard, for example, that as a kid, he was always chauffeured to school. He'd be chauffeured, and then his nanny or the chauffeur, someone, would carry his briefcase into the classroom for him. That's how pampered he was, right?
So I wanted to know
if that was true. It was true. That did happen, right? So all these little stories and then more, and I wanted to know about his life in Australia, and I wanted to know about, his memory of growing up in his grandfather's house, right? So he was born in the house of my great-grandfather, the banker. And I'd only seen it in photographs. So I wanted to know, what was this place like? And, my dad was an amazing artist. So he took out a piece of paper and literally sketched out the entire plan.
Oh, wow.
of the house. This is the main house. These were the servants' quarters. There was a fruit orchard, apparently. There was a tennis court, and the driveway, like he could sketch it out as if he was back there the day before, which of course he would be able to. It was his childhood home, right? But I didn't know intimately what it was like. The other side of that story was when the Japanese invaded Singapore, during World War II. The Japanese occupied Singapore for 3 years. And it was an extremely difficult time for most Singaporeans. A lot of them were sent away to concentration camps. A lot of them were done away with. But his family, I guess because of their social position, number one, but also because the Japanese general wanted to live in their house, he took over their house. So the Japanese general that was, had invaded Singapore, took over the main house, and my dad and his immediate family moved into a back house on the property during the war years.
Oh.
And the grounds became kind of like, mission control. And a lot of troops were camped out literally on their lawns.
Wow.
So he grew up as a little kid, getting to know these Japanese soldiers. He even learned to speak a little bit of Japanese, right? Because they were in his yard, right? So many of these little magical stories that I didn't know, were revealed on these car rides in that sort of 6-week period.
And I'm seeing the through line for someone who then had a certain wanderlust and didn't want to be sort of boxed in, mainly because of what he saw as a young child, to witness something like that kind of displacement.
Completely.
Would leave an imprint, pretty strong one.
To live with kind of the terror of the invader and the head of the invaders literally in your house, it's got to do something to you, right? We never went there because my dad was also not an emotional person. So he would tell stories, but he was not one to, really discuss his feelings, right? But he saw it, as being lucky, right? It could have been a lot worse for his family.
Yeah. A lot of people lost family members, lost their own lives, lost everything they had built up.
Yeah. And my own grandfather was, taken away, right? Because they were actually...
What does taken away mean?
They were executing all the able-bodied men, able-bodied, educated men. So a whole generation of men were taken away and assassinated. And so he was taken up. They came for him one day, early on. This is another family story, which has made its way into Crazy Rich Asians, the novel, right? And he was in a line to be executed, except that whoever was in that regiment, the colonel or, whoever was supervising it, recognized my grandfather as the doctor, that had treated him, I believe. And he was like, oh, wait a minute. This was my doctor. We're not going to kill him. So he saved his life from the firing squad. Pulled him out, And, I think the trauma of what my grandmother had to go through, like thinking you'd never see your husband again, right? And then him returning a few days later. I think all of that must have really also affected my dad.
The novels that you write are rich and interesting, and your own family story is as rich and deep, as interesting as anything that you have written. At the point when you were taking your father 2 hours back and forth, that says something about just how big Houston is, that it would take that long to get downtown and back to your family home. Were you writing at that point? Were you starting to put the sort of architecture for these stories together? Because you had gone to Parsons, you were working as a graphic designer. Your life was headed in a completely different direction before you became an internationally renowned best-selling author.
At that point, I had already authored 2 books, which he lived to see, but they were nonfiction books, right? It's interesting how for so many decades, I think would just do anything to avoid my family, my heritage, my background.
Why? Why were you running? Or
I think it wasn't really running. It was more, I think, it was a means of self-preservation, number one. And I think it's a way to, I didn't want to be stereotyped, right? And I think it's something I think a lot of people from immigrant backgrounds go through as they assimilate into a new culture, right? You don't want to be that guy that opens a Chinese restaurant. You want to distinguish yourself in a world beyond your racial heritage. You know, John Chu speaks to this as well, too, of how he had to make it in Hollywood and do these movies that were not personal, that had nothing to do with his background, his family story, until he achieved a certain level of success as a filmmaker, you know. And that was when he allowed himself to even entertain the possibility of making a movie like Crazy Rich Asians, which for him and for me, ironically, blew up our lives exponentially in the most incredible ways, right? So I had a whole career as a fine art photographer. You know, I was showing my work in museums, really. And even back then, you know, my work had nothing to do with my background, my heritage, Asia, any of that. But I think spending that time with my dad, reinvoking those memories of his childhood, my childhood, and then also really seeing just how precious life is, you know, and how short, really. You just, you know, we don't know when we're going to die. Right. And I had always had this plan of, you know, maybe when I'm 60 and I'm retired, I'll put pen to paper and start writing down these stories. But here I was with a guy, you know, who was facing his mortality up close every single day. And I said, you know what? I'm going to begin writing now. So I began writing, you know, when he was sick.
What character did you start with?
I started with Eleanor, the mother, and the Bible study, sitting around with her friends, hearing the gossip that her son's got a new girlfriend. That was the first chapter I wrote. Yeah. And, you know, the rest is history.
Indeed. People love those books. They pass them around. I imagine when you go to book signings, people are showing you books that have been much loved, much read, dog-eared. Do people thank you also for telling a story that maybe we haven't seen enough of on the page?
I do get that a lot, you know. And then I also meet readers of Asian descent, right? And some of them really, you know, really take the time to tell me their special stories. And it's just, you know.
That's a special thing when you can do that.
It's beyond.
Open a portal for people to share their histories because so many people don't. Yeah.
But who would have thought that in telling these stories that are so personal and so, you know, I don't use the word exotic, but you know what I mean. You know, they're so specific to a time and a place and a culture in an island that's a dot on the equator, that a woman in Palo Alto or in Seattle growing up as an Asian American can feel seen.
Someone told me
it's
something that if you have a story on your heart or in your mind, you need to tell it because someone needs to hear it. That to hold on to stories can be an act of preservation, but it can be an act of generosity to tell a story. And I think you have told stories that not just entertain people, but embolden them to maybe look at their own histories and to help them feel seen and understood and valued.
Yeah. Well, thank you for so eloquently putting it into words. I was not expecting to get choked up.
It's okay. It's all right.
But,
it happens, especially on this podcast where we're asking people about their history and their mama's kitchens and asking them to go down memory lane. We also ask them for recipes. And we might have to get a second recipe from you because, or at least I want to know more about the coconut jam, but the recipe that you reached into your family lore to share with us were these curry
puffs.
Curry
puffs. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's another name for them, but curry puffs, which is puff pastry filled with deliciousness. And I want to know more about the curry puff. When was it served?
So, it's just a quintessential Singaporean Malaysian snack food, right? Mm-hmm. They're almost like, little empanadas, truly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
almost every culture has some version of whether
exactly.
it's a knish or a samosa
a baked puff pastry filled with, in this case, curry beef. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think it so is representative of the hybrid culture that Singapore became, right? Singapore was a crossroads of Indians, Malays, Chinese, British coming together, right? And so the curry puff to me signifies all of that. You've got this Indian curry filling in this almost British-like puff pastry. I haven't done all the research into the actual historical, culinary sort of background of it, but it's a hybrid dish that is so popular in Singapore that it's served as a snack, but it's also served at high tea, right? Okay. So when you go to a good hotel in Singapore, they'll have a beautiful high tea dish that has the cucumber finger sandwiches and the scones, but also the curry puffs.
3-tiered serving tray that will come to the table.
On the sweets. And so, it's ubiquitous there. But I think, food really connects you back to your culture, right? And it's one of the few things that I really always remember my dad making. I think he missed having curry puffs. So he created his own recipe for them.
I look forward to road testing this one. You and I are in touch, so I will let you know.
Fantastic.
When I
let me know how it tests
and
out.
Let you know how they turn out. I think a lot of people are going to try this one as well. I have loved talking to you. We could go on and on.
Same here.
May have to have you back for part 2 because there are so many other questions I had, but I've taken a lot of your time, so I'm going to let you go.
It's been a pleasure and a delight just sharing time with you. I wish we could do it over curry puffs, but we'll
maybe one day we
Yeah.
will. I will assume that we will find each other at some point and get in the kitchen. We absolutely should. Well, I have loved this conversation. Thank you very much.
Same here.
Much love to you. Kevin, thank you so much for sharing so much of your rich, literally and figuratively, family history with us. Now, before we let you go, if hearing Kevin's story inspired you to want to plan a trip to fly far and experience just a little bit of luxury wherever you happen to go, make sure to check out Airbnb's luxury stay options. I know that's how I like to travel. Who doesn't like a little bit of luxury? As always, our inbox is open for you to record yourself and share with us some of your own mama's recipes, maybe some memories from the kitchen that you grew up in, maybe some thoughts on some of the stories that you've heard on this show. Make sure to send us a voice memo or a video recording at ymk@highergroundproductions.com for a chance for your voice to be featured in a future episode, or perhaps one of your videos to be featured on YouTube when we migrate there. And if you want to try making those curry puffs, be sure to check out the recipe at yourmamaskitchen.com. You can find all the recipes from all the previous episodes. And Kevin went to such great lengths to make sure that you could follow that recipe. So make sure that you go to the website and check it out. I have loved this conversation. Thanks for being with us. Please come back next week and the week after that, because here at Your Mama's Kitchen, we are always, always, always serving up something delicious. Until then, be bountiful.